All right, so we are going to start with the book of Maccabees today. Last week where we left off was talking about Hanukkah, and so we didn't make it into talking about actually what is said in the book of Maccabees about Hanukkah. If you are new to this class, let me just remind you that we are talking about the time between the Testaments. We do not consider Maccabees to be part of our Bible, but it is a good historical book, a good historical reference for what is happening during our time between the Testaments. So today we're going to jump right into the book of Maccabees. So last week where we kind of left off was with this slide, which are what are some things that we know about Hanukkah. This is a list that was compiled by my friends and family when I randomly texted them. They still all think that I'm weird, but that's good. And so this is what they had come up with. The biggest answer, of course, was that it was the Festival of Lights. And then, of course, some other people knew a few things about the oil and that it has to last 8 days. No one's really sure why they know these things, but these are just things that are popular in culture. So I wanted to go ahead and look at what the book of Maccabees actually says about that. So today we're actually going to read from both 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and we're going to talk about the story of Hanukkah in Maccabees. So to get started, remember that 1st and 2nd Maccabees are often compared to the Gospels and that they are very synoptic in their stories. They tell the exact same stories, but they tell them from different perspectives. And so the book of 2nd Maccabees is a lot more flowery in its writing. The book of 1st Maccabees is actually more succinct and to the point. So we're going to start with 1st Maccabees, and here is what it says in 1st Maccabees about the festival of Hanukkah. Then Judith and his brothers said, "Behold, our enemies have been crushed. Let us go up to purify the sanctuary and rededicate it." And so the entire army assembled, and they went up to Mount Zion. There they found the sanctuary desolate, the altar desecrated, the gates burned to the ground, the courts overgrown with weeds as in a thicket or on some mountain, and the chambers of the priest in ruins. Then they tore their garments and uttered loud cries of mourning. They sprinkled their heads with ashes and fell prostrate with their faces to the ground. And when the signal was given with the trumpets, they cried out to heaven. Then Judas designated men to engage in combat with those in the citadel while he purified the sanctuary. He appointed blameless priests who were devoted to the law. These purified the sanctuary and carried off the stones of the abomination to an unclean place. They discussed what should be done about the altar of burnt offerings that had been desecrated, and they made the proper decision to demolish it so that it would not be a source of lasting shame to them inasmuch as the Gentiles had defiled it. Therefore, they tore down the altar and stored up the stones in a suitable place on the temple hill until a prophet should come on the scene to determine what should be done with them. They took unhewn stones, according to the law, and built a new altar fashioned from the former one. They also repaired the sanctuary and the interior of the temple and purified the courts. They made new sacred vessels and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. Then they burned incense on the altar, and they lit the lamp on the lampstands to illuminate the temple. Finally, they placed loaves of bread on the table and hung the curtains, thereby bringing to completion all the work that they had undertaken. Early in the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, that is the month of Kislev, in the year 148, they arose and offered sacrifice in accordance with the law, on the new altar of burnt offerings they had constructed. On the anniversary of the day on which the Gentiles had desecrated it, on that very day it was dedicated with hymns, harps, flutes, and cymbals. All the people prostrated themselves in adoration and praised heaven, who had granted success to their endeavors. They celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and joyfully offered burnt offerings and sacrifices of praise and thanksgiving. They decorated the front of the temple with gold crowns and shields. They restored the gates and the chambers for the priest and furnished them with doors. There was great rejoicing among the people, inasmuch as the disgrace inflicted by the Gentiles had been removed. Then Judas, his brothers, and the entire congregation of Israel decreed that the days marking the rededication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days every year on the anniversary, beginning on the 25th day of the month of Kislev. So let's go back to our list. How many of these things did you guys actually see in the story of Hanukkah in the book of Maccabees?
It lasted 8 days.
8 days. What else?
Well, the main focus was the altar and getting it repaired and cleaned from the desecration, and that's nothing.
Right. Okay, so really the only thing on this list that we've covered so far is that the Maccabees were involved and that it lasted 8 days. That's it, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and see what the book of 2nd Maccabees says about it. 2nd Maccabees, even though it is a much more flowery book in terms of writing, it actually has a much shortened version of the story of Hanukkah. So here we go in 2nd Maccabees 10. Under the guidance of the Lord, Maccabeus and his companions recovered the temple and the city, destroying the altar erected by the Gentiles in the public square and tearing down their sacred precincts. After they purified the sanctuary, they built another altar. Then, striking fire from flints, they offered sacrifice for the first time in 2 years, burning incense, lighting lamps, and setting out the bread of the presence. When they had done this, they prostrated themselves and implored the Lord never again to allow them to be afflicted with such misfortunes, and were they ever to sin, to discipline them himself with moderation, rather than hand them over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. The purification of the temple took place on the very same day on which the temple had been profaned by the Gentiles, that is, the 25th day in the same month Kislev. The celebration and rejoicing lasted for 8 days in the manner of the Feast of Booths, as they recalled how, only a short time before, during the Feast of Booths, they had been living like wild animals in the mountains and caves. And so, carrying wands entwined with ivy and leafy branches and palm fronds, they offered hymns of thanksgiving to him whose guiding hand had enabled them to achieve the purification of his holy place. They also decreed by a public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole Jewish nation should observe these days every year. Okay, so again, let's go back to our list. Which things have we now covered? Anything different?
They lit candles.
They lit candles, so at least we have some candles in there now. All right, so if we don't get any of this stuff from the book of Maccabees that has to do with Hanukkah, where do we get it? Any guesses?
Mishnah?
The Mishnah. Excellent. Yes, we're going to get it from the Talmud. Remember, the Talmud is composed of the Mishnah and the Gemara, and the Talmud is what tells us how to interpret our laws, how it's going to actually go through and tell us how to interpret our stories. So this is where we are going to get all of our traditions of Hanukkah. It is not actually included in any type of scripture at all. So the Talmud is actually the one that is going to tell the story of the Maccabees entering the temple, and they're going to find a small vat of oil that has not been defiled when Antiochus came in and stormed the temple and then thus defiled it. That jar was supposed to be enough oil to keep the candles lit for 1 day, but miraculously it lasted 8 days until they could find some additional undefiled oil that was consecrated. So then we're going to have our menorahs, which we did talk about several times in the story of Maccabees with the lampstands. The lampstands are actually going to be these menorahs that are very symbolic of what the candelabras were in Solomon's temple. And so I do have pictures of that here in a second. The dreidel is never mentioned, even though that's one of our most popular games during Hanukkah. It is a game that you play with, and it has 4 sides to the dreidel. Again, I have pictures in a minute. Each letter has a different letter. Each side has a different letter on it, and that actually, it's the first letter of the Hebrew phrase that means a great miracle happened there. If you are in Israel, you have a different dreidel, and it says a great miracle happened here, so there is a different set of dreidels for those people who are in Israel. And then, of course, we're going to have our foods, because food is part of every celebration, every feast, but especially during the time of Hanukkah, we have a lot of oil, foods that are fried in oil, and that is because they are symbolic to the miracle of the oil. Then we're going to have cheese, which is also shared during Hanukkah, and that actually has ties to the story of Judith, which is another apocryphal book. So we're going to take a segue real quick before we get into the pictures, and I want to talk about the book of Judith. So Judith is going to be one of our other apocryphal books, and let me just be honest, it's really hard to find an artist rendering of Judith where she is clothed, so this is a good example for you that I felt might be appropriate to share at church. So Judith, her name is actually Judith, which is in Hebrew, it's the feminine form of Judah. And so this story is very similar to Esther in that it is a short story in which a woman uses her feminine wiles in order to get in and to save the Jewish nation. So Judith is a woman who lives in Jerusalem during a time when the Assyrians are sieging the city. This is actually kind of up for debate because in the story it actually mentions Nebuchadnezzar, but it doesn't mention Nebuchadnezzar by name. It just says that he is a barbaric ruler. So a lot of people actually interpret this to have happened during our Second Temple time period, and they actually consider this barbaric rule to be one of the Antiochuses of the time. But more than likely, this is actually a story that took place many years before when Nebuchadnezzar was the king. But Judith is a very faithful woman. So I'm going to summarize the story of Judith for you, rather than typing it all out. So Judith is a widow. She is a very wealthy widow, and after her husband dies, she only wears widow's clothes. She is very, very beautiful. She is well known and well liked in her community. And one of the reasons why she is so well known and so well liked is because she is very, very faithful to the Jewish traditions. She's a very kind person in terms of she treats all of her workers well because, again, her husband was very wealthy. Rather than, she did not have any kids, so she actually is running her business or her husband's business and fields and everything, which again for this time period is very different because women don't inherit land. So what happens is the Jewish people are about to be captured by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians, we talked about just a little bit, horrible, horrible barbaric people. So they're all trying to decide what they're going to do. So Judith prays about it, and she decides that she has a plan. And so she goes to the elders of their area and says that she has a plan, and they just tell her, good luck. She doesn't want to tell them what the plan is because she does not want to make anybody question what her plan is and whether or not it will work. So Judith goes home, she bathes, she puts on all of these really elaborate clothes that no longer make her look like a widow, and she decides to go into the Assyrian camp. She takes with her her own food and her own wine because, again, she is very faithful to her own traditions, and so she takes her own food and wine with her. So when she gets in there, again, she's so beautiful that everyone is just looking at her. All the soldiers are just completely infatuated with her because she is so beautiful. And so Holofernes, who is the leader of the Assyrian people in this area, he is, of course, absolutely infatuated with her as well. So he allows her to stay in the camp for 3 days. And after the 3rd day, he decides that he can't take it anymore. So he sends one of his eunuchs to persuade her to come and spend the night with him. And this isn't like a buddy-buddy sleepover. This is like a legit, she's going to spend the night. So she goes in, and again, she uses her food and her wine. When she gets there, Holofernes has already been drinking. So he's already kind of to the point of drunk at this point. He keeps drinking. The book of Judith actually tells us that he drinks more than he's ever drank in his entire life, and that he is drunk to the point that he ends up passing out. So nothing ever happens between him and Judith. But because he has passed out, Judith takes this opportunity to take his sword and decapitate him. So she takes his head and puts it in her bag, and then she and her maid leave. And because she had been supposed to have been spending the night, he had actually told the people at the gate that if she felt like she needed to leave after they'd spent the night together, it was okay to open the gate for her. So she gets out, she goes back to the Jewish people, shows them his head, and they all know that they're rescued. Meanwhile, back at the camp, they just think that this night is just a little bit longer than it should be. So the next day, it's kind of getting to the point where they're like, hey, we're supposed to go to war. We probably need to go get our leader. And eventually they go in and they find him decapitated. Needless to say, the Jewish people are saved from the Assyrians, and Judith is then hailed as this hero. Now, where we're going to get cheese is a great question, because cheese is never mentioned in the book of Judith. In fact, it says that she takes like figs and dates and some special oils, stuff like that. She does take her own wine, so we know that. But about the 14th century, the Jewish leaders decide that, of course, salty cheese is what made him drink more wine. And so that's why we have cheese in our story of Hanukkah. So, all right. So going on, now I just have pictures. This one over here is actually what our temple candelabra looked like. Remember, our temple candelabra only has 6 arms, and then has our shamash, which is our servant candle, which is always going to be in the middle. It only had 6 arms. But again, to symbolize the miracle of the 8 days, our Hanukkah candelabra has 4 on each side with our shamash in the middle. So you can tell that these are very similar in the way that they were designed. They are supposed to look very similar. Now, if you are interested in buying either of these, Amazon. Totally stole the pictures right off of Amazon. And then here we go. Here are our dreidels. These dreidels actually say the miracle happened there. So this is not our set of Israeli dreidels. This is just a random set of dreidels. Again, all this stuff for sale on the internet. And then this is a picture of our traditional Hanukkah meal. These are our cheese things. Most people have like a cheese, kind of almost like a cheese Danish, a cheese roll-up of some sort, but you can also just have cheese bread, which I think is what they do. These are our latkes, which are our potatoes that are fried in oil. Again, we have our roast or our meat brisket of some sort, because again, we have to have a kosher animal. We can't have any ham like at our Christmas feast. And then down here are our souvenir, which are the jelly donuts that are also fried in oil. And then over here is our challah, which we have at pretty much every Jewish meal. So again, one of the problems with this meal is that if you're going to have your latkes with your sour cream, or you're going to have your cheese bread with your meal, it can't be a kosher meal. So you really have to decide if you're going to have your cheese bread and your sour cream with your latkes at the same time as your meal. Depending upon what type of Jew you are, you either have to wait 1 hour to 6 hours to eat, because you can't have your dairy and your meat together. So you might have to wait a little bit of time. That's why there's this big debate over whether or not you serve your latkes with applesauce or you serve them with sour cream. Again, it's going to go back to your kosher laws. I know way too much about kosher laws, so if you're ever curious, just let me know. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. Again, that's also why you can't have cream-filled donuts, so keep that in mind too. I don't like jelly donuts, so I'd be all about the cream filling, not so much in my kosher law. Oh, and also for your challah, remember too, during our meal we can't have butter, so we have to have margarine, and your margarine actually has to be made sure that it is oil-based margarine with absolutely no dairy at all. Okay, any questions about that before we move on? Again, never underestimate the amount of random and worthless information that I know. Okay. All right, so moving on now, we're going to, this is actually going to be our prelude to the Hasmonean Kingdom. And the Hasmonean Kingdom has already kind of started up to this point, because this is where we have our Maccabees coming in, our Maccabees taking over Jerusalem. And when this happens, they're going to actually be our Hasmonean family, and that is where we're going to get our Hasmonean Kingdom. So the Maccabees are going to lead a lot of rebellions. Remember, we talked last week about they were very much into guerrilla warfare, and so eventually they are going to get to a point where they gain semi-independence from the Seleucids. Now, they are never considered to be their own real standalone kingdom. There's about 5 years of peace in there, and so during that time period they are considered to be their own kingdom, but they're always kind of under the cloud of another big empire. So they are separate, but at the same time, there's always kind of that threat of somebody else coming in because they're super small. So one of the other things I did want to point out is that during this time, when the Maccabees start their revolts, one of their first wars actually takes place on the Sabbath. And so the Seleucids decide that an excellent way to come in and conquer our Jewish people would be to engage on a war on the Sabbath, where they're not going to fight back because that's work. They can't engage in any type of conflict on the Sabbath. So during this battle, the Seleucids come in, they murder 1,000 men, women, and children because they will not fight back. So at that time, they decide that this is obviously something that God wants them to do. And so the Jewish people make the decision that they will fight on the Sabbath regardless of what the law says, because this is obviously something that God wants them to do. God wants them to be able to gain their independence from people who are telling them that they can't have their own type of worship. Because remember, the Seleucids had outlawed everything that the Jewish people were supposed to be doing. So one of the ways that they actually are able to overcome the Seleucids is they are going to make an alliance with the Romans, and they are going to hire some Roman mercenary soldiers to come in and help them get the Seleucids out of Jerusalem. Now, how many people in this room think that calling in the Romans is a good idea? It's not, but this is the first time they do it, and this time it works out pretty well, which is why they're going to call them in a second time, which is not going to be good. All right, so the Hasmonean family, they are not from the line of Judah, so they should not be kings. Based upon our stories of the Old Testament, they should not be kings. They are priests from the family of Levi, and so therefore they should only be using their role as the priest. They are not from the line of Zadok, but they can be a priestly family. So then we're going to have a whole bunch of conflict that's going to happen within our Hasmonean family. And things are just going to get real crazy. And this is where you're going to go home thinking, I'm so glad that my family reunions are not this crazy. So Judah's going to die. Judah Maccabees is actually going to die in a battle. And then he's going to have his brothers follow him in a different line of succession. Each brother gets a little more Hellenistic. And so at first, kind of think about it like the Church of Christ evolution, where maybe we have a church that does some hand clapping or hand raising, and you know that can really cause a lot of problems within the Church of Christ. So, but it's not a huge step, right? Like we didn't go flat out to instrumental music. We're not those people. So we're going to have just a little bit of Hellenism added every time, but they're still waiting for this earthly ruler. In the book of Maccabees, it talked about how they were waiting for a prophet to come and tell them what to do with this desecrated altar. They are still very, very much waiting for an earthly ruler to come. And in fact, Josephus tells us that one of the rulers, Simon, who is a brother of Judah, when he gets sworn in as the high priest forever, until there should rise a faithful prophet, because they fully recognize that they are not the people who should be doing this, but they're going to do the best they can and kind of hold things together until that real prophet should come. And so eventually, Simon's nephew, John Hyrcanus, is going to come in and take control. And when he does, things are really going to kind of start to get crazy, because he decides that he is going to try to expand the kingdom. Now remember, this is a kingdom that only came to be because they hired mercenary soldiers to come and help them become a kingdom. So why they think that they can expand without help, no one's really sure. But they do make a little bit of progress in that they are able to go through and take 3 different lands: Transjordan, Samaria, and Idumea. The Idumeans, they force to become Jews, and this is going to be a big point of contention later on. Can anybody tell us, going forward in history, who our most famous Idumean is? It's okay if you can't. This is Herod's family right here. And this is where most people think that Herod's family is forced to convert to Judaism comes from. Because we know just by our New Testament that Herod is not the most Hasidic or the most pious of Jews, but it's probably because he was forced. His family was forced to become Jewish. And so there isn't that history that you would have of a willing conversion of some sort. So keep that in mind, because those Idumeans are going to come up several times. There's going to be a lot of internal fighting, and this is going to really result in a flat-out civil war. And when I say civil war, I mean they don't have to worry about what the Seleucids are doing or who they called in the Romans, because they are going to try to take each other down. This is really where we see those Pharisees and those Sadducees really start going at each other, and it's going to become really bad. So as the rulers become more and more Hellenistic, they become more and more corrupt. They are definitely starting to take in that extra money, those extra tithes to the temple. They're stealing them for themselves, and it's going to really splinter the Jewish people. So this is where we're going to have our third sect of Judaism come up. We already have our Pharisees and our Sadducees. Now enter the Essenes, which are going to be our next Jewish group of people. The Essenes actually start out as a really good idea, because they are the ones who are going to say, neither the Pharisees or the Sadducees are doing what they're supposed to be doing, so let's just get out of Dodge and we're going to become our own people. So they decide that they want to be the best the most pious people that they can be, and they purposely removed themselves from Jerusalem so that they can actually do their own thing, and they don't have to fall under any of the Hasmonean laws, because they do not feel like what the Hasmonean people are doing. So when this happens, they believe that the priesthood is corrupt. Again, the priesthood is corrupt, and we know that because the priesthood is not the legitimate priesthood at this time. Neither are their kings the legitimate kings. So you can definitely see where they're coming from. They start as a very, very pious community of believers, but the further that they get removed from society, the more selective and the more self-inclusive they become. If you want to join the Essenes, we have some different rules that you have to follow. Josephus tells us that there's actually a 1-year waiting period in which they will kind of observe you, and they will observe your piety. And then if they decide that maybe you can become a member, you have 2 years of probationary membership before they will fully allow you into the community. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we don't know about until much later, 1947, much later, it says that there's a 1-year probationary period in which you're watched, and then 1 year of probationary membership. But regardless, it's very hard to get into the Essenes. The Essenes then, they kind of put their own laws into practice, where they have their own dietary laws, they have their own types of worship. They do not believe in animal sacrifice, so all of their sacrifices that they do are like grain offerings and other types of offerings that, again, are not really what the Torah says, but they're kind of taking their own laws. So the further that they get removed from society, the further that they actually get away from the Torah as well. But again, they start out with really good intentions. They grow to a community of about 4,000 people, and then we know that, and then they completely disappear from history. And one of the reasons why nobody really knows what happened to them is because more than likely, based on what history has told us, they practiced chastity, and so they weren't really expanding as a people. There are some discrepancies. There is a lot of work out there. If you are curious about the distinctions of what happens in the Essene community, which the Essenes are more than likely the Qumran people, and the Qumran people are the Qumran scrolls, which turn out to be our Dead Sea Scrolls, and I have some pictures of those in a second. But again, because they have put all of these laws into practice, they're practicing chastity, which is nowhere in our Old Testament. They're also practicing total communal living, where they have literally gotten rid of everything and they are only living in a communal setting. That's why more than likely they just die out. And we don't really know anything about them. There are a few references about them in history, but until the Dead Sea Scrolls are found in 1947, no one really knows anything at all about them.
Remind me of the Quakers.
Yes, that's very true, yeah. Okay, so this is actually a picture of the Qumran area where they go, and this is actually pictures of where they find the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, as you can see, like there's some little caves up here, and that's actually where they find the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, they don't find them until 1947. What's very interesting about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that, think thousands of years by this point, they have, we know that Scripture was established finally in about 1300. Not until 1947 do we actually find our oldest, most original scrolls with our most complete Bibles, which are not obviously Bibles, but our most complete scriptures. And it is amazing to see just what a great job those people did all those years ago of translating the books that should actually be in the Bible and picking the correct ones. Because like the book of Judith that we know we just talked about, an apocryphal book, it was not actually found in Qumran. So it shouldn't have been included in the Bible because we know that they didn't even know about it at that time. And obviously, it doesn't really sound like anybody really tried to interpret it until the 13th or 14th century anyway. Okay, questions about anything up to this point?
So the Essenes, they preserve the scriptures, which
Yes.
for us is great.
Absolutely.
Were they involved in writing? I mean, in copying? Like, were they scribes?
They were. They did make their own scrolls, and they did do some of that. Now, they did not do it to the extent of the people later on. But they do write it all down, and they actually compiled their own, which is why we have the full text. And that's where, like when we were talking about the Samaritans, they had the pre-Samaritan text. So we know that those are the oldest because they were writing it down. Yeah. But again, the compilation is a huge thing as well, just because of the extent of things that they did. Now, keep in mind that some of the stuff that they have actually goes through, and it will talk about Jesus as well. And so some of that stuff is not just our super Old Testament, but it actually will have some references to New Testament as well. Yes?
Wasn't there a sort of Christian group in America called the Shakers that were like this?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And the Shakers, if I believe, didn't the Shakers kind of branch off from the Quakers? Okay, that's what I was
You know
thinking.
more than I do at that point.
But they died out because
They did, yes, because they were that communal community with, yes. No.
one of the things I was listening to was talking about the Sadducees and referred to them as the mafia of the day.
Who was this?
I think it was I can't remember if it was Bible Project or if it was Bema, but they referred to Sadducees as the mafia
Yes.
of the day.
Yes, I could definitely see that. Especially as we get on into our Roman Empire, it's going to get good. Yeah. Okay, so by this point, I really don't know what my next slide is. I'll be completely honest. Oh, yes, I did put this up here. So this was a summary. Last week I had our summary just between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So this week I wanted to include the Essenes because we see, again, no group is really that great. Nobody is doing what really they should be doing according to our Old Testament laws. Now, the Sadducees and the Essenes are tied together. And that is very interesting because we have very drastically different ideas. Remember, our Sadducees are all about Hellenism. Our Essenes are all about the law, and they take it a step further to be even more extreme. But our Sadducees, remember, are the people who dismiss all of our oral traditions. And the Essenes do that too. At least for a time, they do that. And so they actually have a lot of those same interpretations of our Torah as the Sadducees do. But again, the Essenes believe they should be a completely separate society. They completely need to remove themselves from Jerusalem in order to be the most pious people that they can be. All right, so moving on. Now there's going to be a change that's coming. And this is where things are really going to start getting crazy, and this is really where it's going to start picking up speed. This is where we're going to have our Romans come in. This is where we're going to have Herod, and this is really where we're going to start seeing all those little nuances that take place between the hatred of people that spill over into our New Testament. So during this time, when the Hasmonean Wars, there's a lot of back and forth between rulers. There's rulers on the Seleucid side that they're turning over very quickly because they're in battle all the time and they're killing each other off like crazy. And then we're going to have a lot of people in our Hasmoneans, the Hasmonean family, and everything that they're doing. There's a lot of discussion about who should be the king, who should be the high priest, can the king be the high priest, and all of that. So by the time we get down to John Hyrcanus, he is going to be, again, Maccabees' nephew. So Judah Maccabees' nephew is how he comes into power. He accepts a Hellenistic culture. And so when he decides to expand the kingdom and convert people by force to Judaism, this is going to make a lot of people very angry. Because again, they feel that Judaism is something that you are born into. You should have those traditions associated with your belief, but he's flat out forcing people to do this. So when he dies, his wish is that his wife is going to become the next ruler, because he thinks that his wife, more than his sons, would be the best ruler. So his idea is that his wife is going to become kind of like the empress, the queen of the area. His son, his oldest son, is going to become the high priest, because obviously we can't have a woman become the high priest. But his son decides that he's going to, when his dad dies, he's just going to do what he wants. So he actually imprisons his mom and his 3 brothers. He imprisons his mom and starves her to death. His brothers actually survive. But I would like to let you know that when this happens, all we know about how he ends up dying is that he dies a very slow and a very painful death. That is all the history tells us. And to be honest, it kind of made me a little happy to hear that, because I was like, you starved your mother to death. Something bad needs to happen to you. But again, I'm not supposed to judge. Okay, so he takes over against his father's wishes. He dies, and when he dies, his widow is going to release his 3 brothers from prison. And so when that happens, one of his brothers, Alexander, is going to take over. Alexander is a huge supporter of the Sadducees. He likes the Hellenistic ideas. He likes that the Jewish people can be in charge. They can have this control over society. That's really what he wants. But he does this to the extreme, and that the Sadducees and the Pharisees really are starting to hate each other more, because the Pharisees don't like the fact that their ruler doesn't like them, that he's sided with the other people. So on his deathbed, he makes a deathbed confession to his wife. He puts his wife in charge, and this time it's actually going to work. His wife actually gets to be in charge. His son then becomes the high priest, but he tells his wife in his deathbed confession that he wants her to make peace with the Pharisees. So she takes this to heart, and she decides that she is going to try to make peace with the Pharisees. And she does this almost to the extreme, where she becomes very sympathetic to the Pharisees, and she really likes the Pharisees, and she even exalts the Pharisees to the point where they actually get places in the Sanhedrin. So before we just had our Sadducees in our Sanhedrin, now we're going to have our Pharisees and our Sadducees in the Sanhedrin. And that, again, more conflict. So she's going to end up dying, and when she dies, her son that gets left in charge is really going to like the Pharisees. Her other son, who is going to start fighting for power, really likes the Sadducees. And so then we're going to have some internal family conflict that is going to really, really start even escalating this war more. I can't even explain to you how this civil war, if this civil war would not have happened between our Jewish people, we would have had a much better footing, at least when Jesus comes, because it would have been at least a little bit more, together, comprehensive ideas. But they hate each other to the point that eventually they are going to appeal to the Romans again. The Pharisees are going to appeal to Pompey the Great, saying, you have to do something. You have to restore our priesthood. You have to demolish and abolish the royalty of the Hasmoneans. So when they do this, the Roman people, of course, because at this point they are still working as mercenaries, they come in. The Pharisees actually go to the gates and open the gates for the Romans to come in. The Romans come in, completely wipe out the Sadducees, and the Pharisees actually go before the Romans can, the Romans are fighting the city, the Pharisees go to the temple and kill the Sadducees in the temple. And so again, let's think about this. When we see the New Testament pick up and we see all these discrepancies between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, this puts it in a little more perspective of just the hatred between these people. Because it isn't just, we don't like what you're doing. This is not just like two denominations going at it. These are people who are willing to kill each other in order to do what they feel like they need to do in terms of the Torah and the Torah law. So eventually our Romans are going to go home, and they're going to realize everyone in the world is hiring us as mercenary soldiers. If we're that great, why don't we just become great? And that's what's going to happen next week when we actually start talking about the Romans. Now, Pompey the Great is actually one of the triumvirate, and he is in the triumvirate with Julius Caesar. So eventually we're going to have a big fight between Pompey and Julius Caesar, and then that's when we're going to get into Mark Antony and Cleopatra and all of that, and we'll get into that next week. So I think that that's actually where I was. I did not think that we were going to make it through everything today. I did not know that we were actually going to have time left over. So what questions or comments do you guys have about this idea? And how does it really help you understand maybe a little bit more about the hatred of the Pharisees and the Sadducees when it comes to the New Testament?
for me, it reminds me, they're not exact parallels today, but there are some similarities in terms of groups who tend to be, more traditionalist type, those who are more comfortable in the secular, and so it just reminds me that battle's old, and it's always been with us, and probably always will be until Christ comes back. And so it's just it's a good reminder to me that that's not unique to our time.
Right. It's not at all.
Well, the Sadducees were very Hellenistic, and we can get our shaking finger, right, and say you shouldn't have been that. And yet, I like having education, and I like having health care, and I enjoy entertainment. And those are the things that they were focused on with the Hellenism. And so I think I would find myself...
I'll pray for your soul.
Some of those things that they elevated are things that we just take for granted as our right.
Yes. Yeah. I completely agree with that. And I have really struggled with this as I've studied it, because I want there to be a good guy. Like, I want there to be a good guy. I want there to be a bad guy. I want there to be somebody that I'm really cheering for. And there's not. It's like, okay, I kind of like you in this area, but not over here at all. Yeah. But, one of the other things that I had read is that because of the Greek drama that was taking place when the New Testament was written, every person that I read is in agreement that the Pharisees were really not that bad. But the Greek drama in the dramatic style of writing has escalated it to make us think that the Pharisees were a whole lot worse than they were. And so I definitely have been looking at that through that idea when I've been reading scripture, and just maybe they weren't so bad. Maybe that's just what I'm being led to believe because of my, needing that good guy and that bad guy. Yes, propaganda literature. There you go, right there. There you go. Other comments?
During this time, was the Greek Empire kind of dissolved or dissolving?
Yes and no. The Greek Empire is still there, but they are splitting more and more and more, because each one of those groups, we have each one of our didache has started fighting each other. And so it's kind of just that constant back and forth. And when they go through this constant back and forth, they're being taken over by little areas. And so they are splitting down. And that's really where we're going to see our Romans come in just a little bit. Again, if the didache could have stayed together, they would not have fallen to the Romans. But because they had that, they just all hated each other, you can recruit each other to kill people you don't like. And that's eventually what they do.
The house divided rule.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. So I just, I like this background. I like the idea of knowing the differences in the different types of Jews. And I like the idea of knowing all the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, again, just because it helps me really refocus my mind when I'm reading through the New Testament. And so I really hope that you guys have found that somewhat interesting as well. Next week, we are going to talk about the Roman Empire, and it is going to be the fastest Roman Empire story you have ever heard, because we're only going to talk about the Roman Empire up to the time of Christ. I don't want to go into the Roman Empire during the New Testament. I might hit some highlights during the New Testament, but the Roman Empire is going to be around for a lot longer than we're going to cover in this class. Remember, we are just the time between the Testaments. And then the last week of the class is when we're going to go through and I'm going to pick up all those apocryphal books that we didn't cover, and we'll just kind of talk about them and why they are still in the Apocrypha, why they were included in the Apocrypha to begin with, and then we'll kind of go from there. And then that will be the last week of class. We only have 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks. Yeah.
You got this.
Thanks.
Yes. To what year does timeline?
This actually, okay, so they reconsecrate the temple, and I think it's like 164 BC, and then the Hasmonean kingdom actually lasts for about 100 years. And then but during this time, the Roman Empire is going to come in about 60 years before the time of Christ. So this is all taking place between that 163 and 60 time period. Yeah, this is, again, just an overview of that whole time. it was really hard for me to pick out highlights of what I wanted to cover. Really hard. But yeah, so next week we'll actually pick up with the start of the Roman Empire. And again, we'll probably refocus on them letting in the Romans, because this isn't like the Romans weren't invited to come in. The Romans are hired to come in. Then craziness ensues. All right, but anyway, that's all for today. Thank you guys for coming. Hopefully I'll see you back next week.